Good afternoon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focusing on Major Lindsey Africa's 2024 in-house council compensation survey. Today, we're going to be discussing the 2024 compensation findings from a top-level national view. And I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleagues, Edina Beasley and Heather Fine. They're going to be talking us through the data and offering their expert insights. My name's Lauren Horan, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. So if you have any questions regarding any technical questions or difficulty, just shoot me a question in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will be happy to assist. Before I pass over to Edina and Heather, I just have a couple housekeeping items to quickly go through. Today's call all participant lines will be muted and your cameras are off. This call is going to be recorded so that you can view at a later time. We're going to be sending out an email of the recording to all registrants. We're going to go about an hour with the presentation and then some time for Q&A at the end. So we encourage you, any questions you have, just enter them in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can at the end. The end of the webinar, there's going to be a quick couple questions survey. If you wouldn't mind taking that, would help us out in knowing how we did today and what topics you want to hear from us in the future. And now I am going to hand over to my colleagues, Edina and Heather, to start the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. Hello, everybody. We are so thrilled to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Heather Fine. I am a partner in our Chicago office, and I've been with the firm for almost 13 years, 14 Chicago winters next year. I spend my time working in the legal compliance and privacy space, and along with my wonderful colleague and partner, Edina Beasley, I've also spent a lot of time thinking about and discussing compensation over the years. So we're very excited for the conversation today. And with that, I'll actually turn it over to Edina to introduce herself and get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Edina Beasley, partner at Major Lindsey Africa, in-house counsel recruiting and board practice groups. I sit in DC, but I work nationwide and internationally, same as Heather. I focus on legal and compliance roles across industries. I graduated from law school in 2009, and I have been in legal recruiting for almost 15 years now. And with that, I think we can get started. Thank you again for joining. Today we have a lot to cover, but before we dive into our 2024 survey results, we thought it would be helpful just to briefly revisit our 2022 survey and see kind of some of the common themes that we found in that survey. So we conducted our 2022 survey during one of the hottest, absolutely most competitive legal hiring markets we've ever seen. And we saw how there were many factors, both COVID and non-COVID related factors that sort of came together and created this tremendous surge in demand for legal talent. And we saw how that surge in demand for legal talent back in 2022 put pressure on companies to increase their legal department compensation almost entirely across the board for all roles we surveyed back in 2022. And we saw that bonuses were actually driving that pay increase back then. We saw how companies were using bonuses as a sort of a creative, budget-friendly way to reward performance, retain talent, and attract new talent during a competitive legal hiring market. Now, fast forward to 2024, we conducted this survey, as we all know, during a very challenging economic climate and geopolitical headwinds, financial market headwinds, geopolitical instability. And as companies grappled with these issues, we noticed two main findings, sort of two main themes emerge from this survey. So first, we saw that base compensation actually remained stable for the most part. And two, variable comp or bonus payouts were used in response to these challenging economic conditions. So we saw that companies are watching their legal spend more closely, and they're making conservative decisions around compensation while still rewarding talent and retaining their future generation of leaders. And Heather's actually going to talk a little more about that as we get to our deputy GC and AGC slides. So you're going to see those themes kind of throughout today's presentation. And before we get into our survey demographics, we thought it would be useful just to briefly go over some of the main findings we plan to cover today. So first, despite economic instability, we saw that base compensation for GCs and CLOs remained stable. That signals this continued value placed on top legal talent, especially as the role of GCs and CLOs is expanding, right, in importance and in scope as well. Two, we're going to see that, we're going to show you that bonus payouts actually dropped for GCs and CLOs. And again, that's where companies have most flexibility in response to challenging economic conditions without touching base pay. We also noticed our survey findings show that attorneys at publicly traded companies are out-earning their private company counterparts. That's not a surprise to us. Unfortunately, women are still earning less than men, although Heather will walk us through this. We see some positive movement at the CLO level, and great movement for Chief Compliance Officer in terms of compensation. We saw tremendous increases for both base and bonuses for CCOs. And lastly, we will talk about different industry trends and different metro area trends. There were some interesting and maybe some surprising findings there. And with that, I think we can look at our survey demographics real quick. All right, so we sent a survey to 35,000 in-house counsel, and we received 2,300 responses from 46 countries. And we surveyed all roles, from counsel to chief legal officer roles. And happy to report that this year we actually have more robust data for CCOs. And also this year, we're trying to look at GC and CLO roles separately, which, and we'll talk about this some more, but that can get tricky, right? Because these titles are often used interchangeably, and these titling conventions vary from company to company. Most of our respondents were men, so 58% men. And unfortunately, most of our respondents were somewhat less diverse this year. 73% white, which is up from 66% in our last survey, 2022. And let's look at company demographics real quick. So in terms of company revenue, we had a truly wide range of companies. So from 100 million in revenue to over 20 billion. And most of our respondents came from publicly traded companies. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to talk about terminology.
Fabulous. All right. Thanks so much, Edina. That was great. All right, so let's get into some details here and start sort of with the basic terminology you're going to hear us use throughout the presentation. So we're going to consistently refer to TAC, which is total actual cash compensation that respondents took home in 2023. So that's the base salary received in 23 plus the actual bonus paid out. So the total cash in 23, again, TAC, total actual cash compensation. You're also going to hear us talk about total target cash compensation, or TTC, which is a respondent's base salary for 2024 plus their bonus for 2024. So again, total target cash compensation. We're going to look at TAC from this survey versus our last survey released in 2022 and examine data from 21 and 22 as it compares over the last couple of years that we've been looking at. And we're also going to look at how total actual cash and total target cash compares and has changed over this 2-year period. So why don't we begin our discussion of the survey results? So let's start by talking about TAC, right, in 2023 by role. So this is the total actual cash compensation in this slide for each position we surveyed, from chief legal officer to general counsel to deputy and so on, as you can see here. The numbers listed in the chart are averages from the survey. So for example, chief legal officers averaged approximately 652,000 from our survey. DGCs averaged approximately 458,000 from the survey, right? So you can see the numbers there. One thing to note is in the past, as Edina had mentioned, we actually combined certain roles in our survey. So for example, we combined chief legal officers and general counsels into one category. We've actually now here broken it up, right? So you can see chief legal officers, general counsels, deputies, associates, they are all separate. And we're doing that to really understand compensation more at in a granular way as we look at each role. And of course, we expect this graph to look the way it does, increasing to decreasing based on roles. One thing we do want to note, and you're going to get a lot of this sort of from our commentary as we're going throughout, is we do see some variances in this throughout our day-to-day work. And in some cases, the numbers seem a little bit lower than what we're seeing, right? So for example, let's take the chief legal officer and the general counsel compensation packages. Frankly, I think if you asked any of the search consultants at MLA, we would tell you that we've seen some of our most competitive packages over the last 2 years. And why may this be, you might ask? CLOs and GCs are continued. That talent continues to be in very high demand, which keeps obviously compensation numbers very competitive. There is candidate competition as well, which is a driving force for compensation. Of course, though, this depends on the company, right? The public nature, the private nature, the industry. Regardless, though, we are seeing some nice packages at the GC, CLO levels. The bottom line is that competition for top talent continues to be very steep, and we expect GC and CLO compensation, we hope, to increase as time goes on. So I'm going to send it back over to Edina to add a little bit more color around the changes we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so when we looked at national average total cash by role and compared it to our last survey, we found that overall base compensation has remained stable. And if you look at the CLO and GC line here, you see there's a slight decrease. That's a decrease of around 1% in total cash when compared to our last survey. And we will break these numbers for GCs and CLOs further in our next couple of slides. But when you look at regional GCs, country GCs, deputies, and AGCs, we notice a slight increase in total cash when compared to our last survey. That was an increase of around 4%, perhaps, really signaling the importance of these groups as the next generation of leaders for succession purposes. And when we look at senior counsel and assistant general counsel roles, virtually no movement there at all. So again, given the economic landscape, it makes sense for companies to make conservative decisions around comp. So here we're not seeing those drastic increases and movement in total cash that we saw in our 2022 survey. So now let's look at GC CLO total cash. So here we're looking at GCs and CLOs combined as one group. So we're not breaking it down into two separate roles for this slide. So we're looking at total cash comp in 2021 versus what we found in our last survey. So you will see, again, there is a slight decline in total cash when compared to our last survey. So base compensation actually went up. So this decline is actually driven almost entirely by bonuses. Bonuses dropped by 10% since our last survey. Again, variable comp, that's a sort of creative, budget-friendly way to address compensation during challenging economic times without touching base compensation. And when Heather and I discussed these findings, we're in the trenches. We do these searches every day, and from where we sit, we are actually continuing to see strong, robust compensation packages for GCs and CLOs. And we do expect that trend to continue, right? As we mentioned earlier, as the role of GCs and CLOs continues to expand in scope and in importance. And also, this is an election year, so it brings a lot of kind of uncertainty, a lot of potential changes. So again, it does make sense to see that companies are being a little more conservative when it comes to compensation decisions. So while there is a decline, right, in overall cash, there are two positives that we wanted to point out, and that is, again, base compensation went up by 4%, and total target cash for this year went up, and that's the last figure that you see here, current year TTC. So it's going to be interesting to see what actually gets paid out in 2024, and we will see you guys in 2 years, and we will report on those numbers and see what happens in bonus payouts for this year. Heather, anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it perfectly.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's look at, so here we broke down CLO versus GC cash compensation, and we see that CLOs out-earn GCs significantly. There is a 23% pay differential in terms of total cash compensation for GCs versus CLOs. And going back to what we mentioned earlier, right, these conventions vary, and we shouldn't assume that a CLO title automatically comes with higher comp. We see smaller companies, 100 million in revenue with CLO titles, and we see companies with billion or billion plus in revenue with GCs. And for larger companies, we see both. So we shouldn't assume that a CLO title automatically comes with higher comp. Heather, anything to add there? Be good.
No, I mean, I think we've talked enough about just titling conventions. I mean, we are talking about, and we're going to get into more of that now, but the titling conventions are something you have to think about, but this is a very interesting slide, and you know, with respect to the chief legal officers.
And you know, titling conventions, we're talking titling conventions even at lower levels, right? This
absolutely.
Season CLOs, we see that throughout legal departments. Good. Well, Heather, why don't you take it away and talk about some deputy GC trends and AGC trends?
Absolutely. So this is actually really exciting, and we're really excited to sort of highlight what we found here and what the data suggested, which are some very positive trends, as you can sort of tell by these graphs. So although the data suggested that CLO and GC base pay generally remains stable with some dips in bonus numbers, DGCs and associate general counsels, here is what we're talking about, combined taken as a group, saw an opposite trend, actually, with an increase in total compensation deriving from a 6% base pay increase and a 4% increase in bonuses between 2021 and 2023, which with total TAC rising from 386,000 in 21 to 404,000 in 2023. So that's actually really quite great news. So of course we want to understand why we might be seeing sort of some of these increases. From our perspective, the increase in the DGC and again, AGC, and we're talking about associate general counsel titles here. And also these folks are managing counsels, as we refer to them in our survey, which means that they have some direct reports, at the very least, one or two, to much, much larger teams. And so this development, this increase in their compensation is very exciting and also expected in some ways, right? So there's several factors contributing to the rise. We believe in this group's sort of compensation levels. And again, in our opinion, which is the rise generally of managing counsels, you know, and their importance in the legal department continues to grow, particularly deputies. And we'll get into that in a second. They began their careers as specialists and now are generalists with managerial responsibilities spanning the legal department and sometimes beyond. Lawyers, many of you are very, very business savvy, serving in leadership roles and are seen as business partners. And also this group is very savvy about compensation, right? And knows how to negotiate. And that's really important when you're talking about this topic. This webinar is not about negotiations. That is a whole other topic, but it's really important as we think about compensation. So we expect the role of these lawyers within companies to expand and grow in the level of importance, and therefore expect a corresponding growth in compensation as well, which is great. So, but why don't we go to the next slide and compare deputy general counsels versus associate general counsels, their cash compensation. So when we did this, you can see deputy cash compensation contrast with associate general counsels, showing that deputies are doing better than the combined totals from the previous slides. So 2023 TACs for deputies was 30% higher actually than associate general counsels. Bonuses, and this is important again, are playing a considerable role in the differentiating compensation between the roles. So for example, on average, the average TAC for 2023 for deputies was about 458,000 compared to about 337,000 for AGCs. So, and then obviously the 2024 target comp is higher for deputies. So it's actually not surprising in some ways that we see deputies out earning associate general counsel counterparts in some ways. It's very important. We've now said this 3 or 4 times throughout this webinar, which is that titling varies across companies, right? So in some companies, there are no deputies and there are associates, but for purposes of just what we are talking about today, the title of deputy and how we're sort of thinking about it and analyzing the data a bit is that it often represents one level below the general counsel or chief legal officer and is often the number 2 in the legal department, right? So deputies have an expanded role and they continue to expand, and they're continuing to expand with growing importance. Many of these lawyers are in the line of succession, meaning they have visibility throughout the organization and work closely with senior leadership teams and boards. They also work very closely with their business partners, and they're managing larger teams. And in many cases, they can be in charge of the whole legal department, particularly if a general counsel or chief legal officer has additional other functions in addition to legal that they are responsible for. So the other thing is that losing deputy general counsel talent is often extremely difficult, and that senior leadership teams and chief legal officers and general counsels don't want to lose that title. The bottom line, or don't want to lose that talent. The bottom line is deputy general counsels are really critical actors in the legal department and in the business overall. Losing them can be really detrimental to a high functioning legal department, and compensation is a key driver in retaining this talent. So the next thing we just want to talk about before I turn it back over to Edina is just pay balance by role, right? So when we talk about that, and maybe when we see the next slide, you'll see that the percentage of total cash compensation consisted of a base salary and bonus for certain roles, right? When we looked at this, our survey shared that for GCs and CLOs, over 40% of their annual cash compensation actually is in bonus payments, right? Which is in line with other C-suite members whose variable compensation is tied to company performance. Across the legal department, GCs and CLOs receive the highest portion of their cash compensation and bonuses, as we'd expect. Regional general counsels, deputies, associates, and assistants are all seeing bonuses making up to 30 to 40% of their total compensation. And at the council level, it's usually about more junior members, about 25% or lower. So if you ask us sort of what we're seeing, we would tell you the same thing, right? We are seeing GC CLO bonuses at least at 50%. But one thing we would notice and note is that with public company general counsels, at least 65 to 75%, and sometimes more, often more, is made up of bonus payment. And the one thing we want to think about too is a company's compensation culture. We have many companies where they're very heavy on the incentives and they are lighter on the base salary. So that's something else to think about here too. And that often happens at the GC and CLO level. We typically see GGC bonuses anywhere from 35 to 50%, and associate and assistant general counsels are 30 to 40%. So in other words, this data aligns with sort of what we're seeing in the market. One thing to note is bonuses obviously are not guaranteed, and some of the more junior searches that we do, we often hear lawyers telling us that they would actually prefer to have a higher base salary and a lower bonus because they want the guarantee of the cash compensation. Similarly, we also hear a lot of lawyers saying that they're thrilled with incentive compensation, and they embrace and prefer that their performance is actually tied to payouts. The company performance and their performance is actually tied to their bonus payouts, and they like that. They like the investment in the company, which is good. So before we shift, Edina, anything else to add in these areas? And I see you have your
nothing to add. Is it echoing? Is my
Can you try it now?
Sorry, guys, while we work through this.
How about now, Heather?
Still echoing a bit.
Okay, I would just go back to my.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh,
No
we're just
echo.
gonna go. Okay.
We're going to go with it. We're going to go with
All right,
it.
I was trying to be tech savvy and figure out how to make this work, but we'll just roll with it. Okay. All right. So national CLO average by revenue. So let's go to that next slide, Lauren, if you don't mind. So we took the responses we received and oh, Heather, are you?
I just talked about that, I think. So Lauren, the next slide.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So we see truly a wide range in compensation for GCs and CLOs based on company revenue. So we see a range of anywhere from 370,000 for companies around 100 million in revenue to over 1.1 million for companies that are 10 billion once they hit that 10 billion revenue mark. And we see that for smaller companies, compensations are similar, but once we get to that 1 billion mark, compensation starts to increase at a higher rate. And once we get to 10 billion, we're talking global multinational companies and GCs and CLOs. Those companies are leading massive legal global teams, supporting robust global business operations. So no surprise here that their compensation reflects that level of responsibility. And again, something Heather mentioned earlier, we're not tracking equity here. And that can be, as she mentioned, anywhere from 75 to 100% or more of a GC or CLO salary. Now we also broke the numbers down by public versus private and looked at those averages. So not surprising, we're seeing that GCs and CLOs at publicly traded companies out earn their private company colleagues. And we found that most of this pay differential is actually driven again by bonuses. So there's a 63% difference in bonuses paid out to public company GCs and CLOs versus private company GCs. And I'll let Heather walk us through some interesting industry and market area trends.
Absolutely good. So I always love sort of these industry to metro slides, the company revenue slides, because I think they do tell us a lot of great things. So let's talk about what we're seeing from an industry perspective. So in the United States, CLOs and GCs in the advertising, publishing, and media industry had the highest average total actual cash compensation in 2023, followed by real estate, energy and public utilities, and then telecommunication, right? So compensation, as I was just saying, related to industry is actually really intriguing, and it can vary, as we all know, based on what's going on in the world, right? So think of the rise and fall of many industries during COVID. In fact, really think about what happened to the travel, leisure, and hospitality industry, right, during that time as an example. So those are things to think about, and why one area may be a 1 year compensating at a very high level, and maybe a couple of years later, it may look differently, right? So as a generalization, though, we do find that highly regulated industries typically pay more. So energy, utilities, telecom, we actually would expect that. And that makes a lot of sense here. We were a little surprised to see the advertising, publishing, and media GCs and CLOs compensated so highly. However, given what's going on in the media space, thinking of streaming services, this might make sense. One thing we also wondered about, candidly, was because of the way we consume information and how we buy things and the advertising that's associated with that, and online, essentially online advertising, that maybe it's become very critical for folks who have a lot of knowledge and are able to really lead and govern during that time of transformation to be paid top dollar. So that was one of the reasons we thought maybe advertising, publishing, and media came out so high. One thing we also will say, and I'll speak for myself here, is that I probably would have expected higher cash compensation within financial services and banking, and then also maybe in pharma and biotech, although this also could be the result of the fact that in biotech, a lot of that compensation may not be in cash, may actually be in equity, and frankly, that falls in a lot of other industries as well, as we know. Respondents in consumer products, medical device, chemical, and restaurant and food services also saw fairly high 2023 total actual cash compensation. So its bottom line is it's really hard to make predictions by industry, right? But these are some of the things that we have just picked up over the data from our last survey. Edina, other thoughts?
Yeah. So when I thought about our last survey, and you're right. For our last survey, banking was higher, financial service. So banking, financial services, retail, sales operations were actually much higher. And retail sales was actually an interesting one, but we thought that was because of the surge in online shopping, right, during COVID. And yeah, a little bit surprised that life sciences was not higher, but interesting findings for sure, and different from our last one.
Yeah, absolutely. The next thing we want to talk about is CLO GC total actual cash compensation by metro area. And I always find this fascinating just because I don't know, it's great information. So basically, where's compensation highest in the US, right? So whereas the national average TAC compensation for CLOs and GCs was around 571,000, local averages diverged widely among major metropolitan areas. The lowest average TAC compensation was in Salt Lake City, and the highest actually was in Miami, the Fort Lauderdale area. The compensation levels in each market actually appear to track common industries in those markets. So for example, noted the highly regulated sectors like energy command higher TAC compensation. So if you look at Houston, obviously their folks are making high TAC in that city. On the other hand, tech-heavy locales like Seattle may see lower TAC compensation because of the equity compensation model that many technology companies use, right? Perhaps unsurprisingly, GCs working in large metro areas like New York and Los Angeles earn higher total actual cash compensation than maybe those working in smaller metro areas. Though interestingly, while a Silicon Valley respondent reported the highest total actual cash for 2023, the next three highest were reported from New York, LA, and Miami. I have to comment that I was a little surprised to see maybe the lower TAC in cities such as Chicago, Boston, and DC. We often see the coastal cities and certainly on the East Coast, folks having very high compensation packages. And Chicago is the third largest city. So those numbers were actually pretty interesting for us. But I don't know, Edina, if you have any specific comments about, I know we talked just sort of why maybe DC is a little lower. I was really pretty surprised by that.
So I believe DC is lower because of our government employees and nonprofit employee respondents. I think those numbers were pushed down by those respondents. And I saw a question about the nonprofit industry. We did, I have to go through the survey again, but I do believe that we did track that. So you can find that data in our survey. This is obviously just a snippet of and some of the main findings, but if you look at the actual survey, scan the QR code, you will find some interesting data on nonprofit and equity as well. Somebody asked about us tracking equity. Equity is going to be on, I believe, page 33 in the report.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else to add, Heather. So should we talk about?
Excellent. I think CCO compensation. Over to you.
So that one is very exciting. So some great movement on CCO comp over the past 2 years. So we saw base pay jump by 36% over the last 2 years. Total cash jumped by 81%. And most of that was driven by bonuses. So bonuses jumped up by 181%. So truly great movement for CCOs. And once again, this is consistent with what Heather and I are seeing when we conduct these searches across different industries, right? We're seeing this increased emphasis on culture, compliance, ESG, and those things are driving the expansion of the CCO role and the importance of the Chief Compliance Officer role. And we also noticed that some regulators are just being a bit more direct in their assessment and, I guess, recommendation, if you will, on elevating the compliance function and the chief compliance officer function into a sort of a independent executive function. So essentially elevating the CCO title as a peer to CLOs and chief financial officers. And I see another question here, do you expect this trend to continue? So that's an interesting one, right? A lot has happened over the past 2 years. I think we're going to continue seeing the CCO role increase in scope and responsibility and importance, but we don't expect to continue seeing this drastic increase, right? Because that would bump up against some of the highest paid C-suite members. Heather, any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, and in some cases the compliance function reports directly into legal, and in some cases it doesn't. And that may play a role into how we see compensation playing out, right? So when it doesn't report into legal, it's also a member of the C-suite directly, often reporting into the board or the CEO. So that may play into compensation as well. I mean, Edina, do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah. There's another question. How are you viewing CCO versus CLO GC when the roles are held by the same person? So I think we're seeing a trend where these roles are separated, right? I know we saw just over the past couple of years, the CCO role is truly becoming this independent executive leadership role. So we don't see those as often anymore, right, Heather?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And if the GC does have the chief compliance officer title, sometimes it's temporary, and so we definitely are seeing more companies hiring direct CCOs and separating that title from the general counsel, especially as the general counsel is taking on more functional responsibilities. I mean, we talk a lot about how GCs really are not just doing legal at all these days. They're doing legal, but they're doing a lot more from a functional perspective. And so, yeah, absolutely. We are definitely seeing them separated more often.
Right. And just wanted to briefly talk about the, so this is an interesting one, average chief compliance officer total cash by public versus private company. So this was a bit surprising when we saw it, but it's typically, we don't see public company CCOs earning less than private company CCOs. I believe this came from just the average CCO who responded to our survey. I think they just happen to be making more than their public company counterparts, but it really comes down to who participated in the survey and who responded. So I don't think this is market trend, right, Heather?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, wonderful. Let's look at ethnicity real quick. So unfortunately, again, our respondents were less diverse this time than when compared to our 2022 survey. And when we looked at these numbers, we found that once again, white attorneys are out-earning, as a group, out-earning Black, Hispanic, and Asian attorneys. And when we broke those numbers down even further, we noticed that Asian attorneys are out-earning Black and Hispanic attorneys as a group. And we try to do something different here. So instead of giving you compensation ranges, we wanted to offer something different. So we're showing you percentage differences from average compensation for these different groups. And these numbers, obviously, they're not good. This was one of the biggest disappointments. I think the gender, Heather's going to talk about gender here in a minute. We have ways to go, right? And we're hoping that as we continue talking about pay equity and as wage transparency laws get enacted in additional states, I think that is going to push us in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And now just looking sort of at the gender, US average TAC by gender, maybe we should shift to the next slide so folks can see that. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. So according to the survey, men on average continue to make more than women, particularly at the GC level. If you notice that, we'll talk about that in a second. although women actually are making more than their male counterparts on average in the chief legal officer, the regional general counsel, and the chief compliance officer roles. So that's actually really interesting and good news. Of course, we want to see parity, right? But it is positive, again, that we are seeing these growing numbers in chief legal officer roles. The disparity, and frankly, Edina and I talked a lot about this, the disparity between male and female general counsels remains, you can see by the graph, at 26%. I don't know that we can pinpoint such reasoning for a large disparity. It was, frankly, we struggle with this. It was disheartening. We're trying to sort of understand the data. Generally, we would say, though, that women continue to be underpaid in comparison to men, and whether this is a question about how women negotiate their compensation or maybe how they advocate for themselves when it's time to ask for pay increases. I don't know that we know exactly how we can answer all of this, but we do hope that the trend reverses and ultimately we see this disparity evaporating. We do want to note in other legal department positions, though, if you see the disparity is steadily decreasing, and that's actually great. And frankly, women and men in the United States reported only a somewhat smaller disparity in average TAC in almost every other role that we are looking at here. And then women in regional general counsel roles continue to make more than men, which was a continuation from our 2022 survey. You know, we expect and hope that the enactment of wage transparency laws across states and discussions around pay equity will move us in the right direction here. But each survey we do, we keep saying that we've got some work to do, and we're hoping for some quicker progress here. So I am going to, and Edina and I think that is it. We just have one other thing we want to talk with you about and sort of end on before we shift over to some questions. We did want to share some overall thoughts here, right? Which essentially is what we've seen from 2019 to 2023. And if you look at the graphs, the news is actually really positive. The National Legal Department average total actual cash compensation is generally stable or increasing. And remember, in these last 4 years, we've had a global pandemic, elections, a financial downturn, excuse me, unprecedented unrest overseas, inflation, and many, many other things going on in the world that certainly is going to affect compensation for folks. So 2023 may have been a stabilizing year, but compensation is still trending upwards. And we believe that's a great outlook for the future and a great outlook for in-house counsel. So this concludes the presentation part of our webinar. We really appreciate you all listening. We are going to do our best to answer some questions. We've got Lauren coming back on, which is great. So we are ready. And to the extent that you have some questions that maybe aren't answered, we'll give you some guidance about reaching out to us directly. There's some very specific things that we would want to talk with you directly if you're talking about a particular position, or otherwise you should, of course, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Edina and Heather, for your insight and advice. And if you want an even deeper dive into the data, on the screen now is a QR code that will take you to our survey report. Also, I have the MLA website there. You can access it from our website. And as Heather just said, if you read the report and having listened to our presentation, you have some more data that you were curious about, please feel free to reach out to us and we will be happy to answer your more specific questions. Just one more quick plug for our regional webinars that are coming up. So if you're curious about a specific market, consider attending our regional webinars that are coming up in this week and next. And the QR code that you see on this page will take you to a registration site where you can sign up for all of the webinars, and it will break down the findings from a local perspective. And with that, we can get to some questions that were submitted. So there's some interesting ones. Thank you everyone for your participation. So let's start with, what are your predictions regarding the trajectory of compensation for the next 2 years? What might we plan to see? I know our compensation survey comes out every 2 years. Do you have any predictions of what that might look like?
So we're going to be positive, because that is sort of what we are. Candidly, I mean, and I think we just ended on this, right? Which is that we are seeing increases in compensation, particularly base compensation levels. And so we expect, especially with how competitive it is in terms of just the in-house market for companies still in terms of hiring, that we are going to continue to see some growth in compensation. Now, it's easy for us to say this. We don't know what's going to happen in the world over the next 2 years, and that really also could impact compensation. But based on what we've seen over the last 4 years, it does have a positive trend. But Edina, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Right. I feel like every time we do these surveys and do the webinars, something major happens, right? It impacts compensation. First, it was COVID and geopolitical issues. So I think you said it well, Heather. We don't know what is going to happen, but I think we're going to continue seeing modest increases. So we're seeing that trend of companies watching compensation more closely. Legal is a cost center for the most part, right? Still seen as a cost center. But I think we're going to continue seeing modest increases, especially at those higher levels and next generation of leaders. So think succession.
I also think one other thing too is that obviously compensation is incredibly important, but folks look at roles a lot and whether or not they're going to have a growth opportunity. And maybe it's a lateral compensation move ultimately, and maybe it's not a growth in compensation, but it's a growth in that type of position. And so, in many ways, companies can offer opportunities that are different than just compensation, right? And there's many ways to do that. So we may see that more of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Great. And what about, I know we've also had some questions on equity. How does equity play into a package for a public company, CLO or GC? Because this did not contribute to our compensation numbers in this survey.
Yeah. So Heather is a master or rock star compensation negotiator. So you all should look at her. She has several webinars out there where we talk about that. But I think it's a significant part, obviously, of GC and CLO compensation, and especially once you get to those larger companies, larger in terms of revenue, it's a significant piece. So we said 75 to 100%, but it could be even more. I had several healthcare searches, and someone actually asked a question about healthcare. I had several healthcare searches where the equity piece was over 100% of CLO salary. So it's significant. And again, we do have some data on this. It's difficult to track. It gets tricky, but we do have some data on equity in the actual report.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think in public companies, you often see equity at least at 100% or over. And again, going back to the compensation philosophy of particular companies, but it is a big, and not only at the CLO and GC level. I mean, we are seeing this at the council level, the senior counsel level, associate and assistant general counsel. And again, that can vary by company, but equity is definitely playing a big role in compensation.
Great, thank you. And what about the CCO comp that has risen so sharply since the last survey? Someone asked, oh, actually, this was answered from when Edina went over it. So yes, continuing to rise CCO compensation. What about different trends in day-to-day work? You mentioned that like MLA might be seeing some different trends. Can you talk more about that at the GC CLO level and then the DGC level?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we talked a little bit about this in the presentation, which is we're just seeing really high packages at the GC and CLO level, particularly with public companies. And I think probably should caveat that, but even the ones that we're doing for portfolio companies or private companies, we are just seeing a lot of competition in terms of compensation at the CLO and GC level, which is great. And so I think maybe when we initially looked at those numbers and saw that maybe that there was a decrease, and before we really looked closer and saw that was related to bonuses, we're all like, what's going on, right? But then when you really dive into the numbers and understand that really it's stabilization, it's not a decrease, we started to feel like, this is making sense. But we really are seeing very high compensation packages for GCs and CLOs, and I think that's across the board. Edina, what do you think?
Yeah, and deputies as well, right? We're seeing more and more everyday handoff in terms of work responsibilities to those second in command, right? To deputy GCs. And that is, it's smart, right? It's for succession purposes, and it does signal the importance of those roles. So we are seeing upward movement for deputies and AGC.
Great. And just to kind of wrap it up, any major surprises or things that you weren't expecting from the results of this year's survey?
It's a good question. Everyone loves asking that.
Yeah.
So I would say for me, no major surprises per se. I would say disappointments, yes. And that goes back to what we discussed in terms of ethnicity, comp numbers, and gender. So those were my two major disappointments. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. That, we would have thought would have made some more progress over the last couple of years. So we'll see what the next couple of years brings us. But the other thing is and maybe surprises, I just found this, I guess maybe because I've done some searches like this recently, but the deputy information I think is really great, right? What we're seeing at the deputy general counsel level and the compensation packages, and from our perspective, just these folks being in line for GC roles and sort of the next generation of leaders. It's really exciting. And so that wasn't, I don't know, surprising. I think it may be exciting and positive is maybe the word I'd want to use there. But and data, listen, I'm not a statistician. I can't even pronounce it, but data is always so very interesting, right? When you dig into things and you look at sample sizes and all of that good stuff, there are just lots of ways to look at things. And those regional webinars are going to be really helpful because there's specific information that varies by region, just like our report was global. We did the US today, right? Those numbers look different. So it's fascinating how that all plays out.
I see a question here about gender pay gap. I'll just go straight to the end of the question. Could this gap be a result of women starting at a lower rate years ago and comp growing at the same rate for both groups? So that's an interesting one, right? It could be, right? I think there's so many factors that are impacting this gender pay gap, and that could certainly be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where wage transparency laws come in, right? And talking about pay equity. And I think that is truly going to push us in the right direction. But that could be one factor, certainly.
And I would say too, some of these topics that we've touched on, they could be webinars within themselves, right? And so we have, 55 or 60 minutes today to talk about just high level on a lot of different things. I mean, there are a lot of topics in here that we really could dive into for a full hour. So maybe we'll have some more webinars where we do, but definitely some interesting questions coming out of all of this.
And I just wanted to share Edina and Heather's contact information because I know this is such an interesting and rich topic that if you have any further questions, just reach out to us and we will do our best to kind of guide you with the information we have gleaned from this survey. And we really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to be here and listen to the data. We're really excited about it. And so I just wanted to, again, thank you all for your time, and thank you to Heather and Edina. You did an excellent job. And as I said earlier, this will be being emailed out to everyone who has registered. So if you want to review the data or share it with colleagues, we would love that. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.